Welcome, all of you, to the Hingham Heritage Museum, the home of the Hingham Historical Society. I see some new faces here, and that's terrific. This has become quite a lively place. Lots going on, whether you want to do personal research or come to events like this, visit the store. There's many things going on, and so we welcome all of you to become members. If you want to learn more about the museum, any of us with these badges on can help you out, or anyone at the door, but welcome. So happy to see you all here. This is the third in a 7-part series, our 2019-2020 lecture series, Waves of Change, and we have had another sellout crowd today, so that's terrific. My name is Eileen McIntyre, and I am honored to serve on the board of the Hingham Historical Society and to co-chair with Elizabeth Danis, who's standing at the door there, the Society's Education Committee. The committee chose the period between the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century to focus on for our lecture series over the course of this next year, because it represents a period of such extraordinary change in our town. Much of this change is reflected in the people and places that are such an important part of our town today. And our topic this afternoon is a really terrific example of that. Our two speakers today will share a fascinating and sometimes surprising array of photos, maps, and stories about an important part of our town's 20th century history that has left a lasting imprint in the form of Bare Cove Park and Wompatuck State Park. Today's program also will provide insights on lesser-known aspects of U.S. naval history in the first half of the 20th century. And I'll now introduce both of our speakers. They will speak one after the other, but I'll introduce them both now. First, Scott McMillan, who you see there on the left. Scott's father, Carlisle McMillan, who was known as Mac, was stationed at the Hingham Naval Ammunition Depot, then situated along the Back River, as a staff sergeant with the U.S. Marine Corps detachment after he returned from World War II service in the Pacific. The family lived nearby on Fort Hill Street. As a child, Scott rode his bike to the gatehouse often to get permission to enter the depot, and once inside, he could play with the children of the commander of the base, who lived at what is now the home of the South Shore Conservatory. Scott graduated from Hingham High School in 1968 and served in the Marines, before joining the Hingham Fire Department in 1973. As a firefighter, Scott served as the superintendent of the fire alarm, using the electrical training he acquired while in the service. Scott and his wife Cheryl raised 2 sons in Hingham. He retired in 2003 from the fire department and was presented with the Robert B. Olson Award for Outstanding Service. Today, Scott is a part-time park ranger at Bare Cove Park, serves on the Hingham Veterans Council, and as commander of the Hingham American Legion, Post 120. He also is a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and chair of the trustees of Hingham's GAR Hall. Among Scott's honors are his selection in 2009 as Veteran of the Year for Hingham, and in 2015 as Citizen of the Year, selected by the Hingham Journal. Most importantly, though, for the topic of today's program is Scott's role in 2009 in co-founding the Green Dock Museum at Bare Cove Park, a fascinating place to visit if you want to learn about the rich history of Camp Hingham and the U.S. Navy Ammunition Depot and Annex, about which we'll hear quite a bit today. Our second speaker will be Jim Rose, who co-founded the Green Dock Museum with Scott. Jim was born in 1946, but his parents, James and Dorna Rose, met at the Hingham Naval Ammunition Depot, where they both worked during World War II. His father was an ordnance leading man from 1941 to 1962. His work at the depot included top secret projects such as the VT fuse and guided missile assembly, both of which we'll hear about today. His mother worked in the rocket plant assembly line. Jim was raised in Rockland and Quincy. He received his BA in geography from Boston University in 1970, and then served during the Vietnam War as a cartographer for the U.S. Corps of Engineers. In 1973, he transferred to the Air Force Reserve and became a public affairs officer. He retired from his military service at Hanscom Air Force Base in 1996, and Jim then worked as a graphic designer for several local ad agencies and high-tech firms before retiring in 2001. Jim and his wife Cheryl live in Hopkinton. He has published several papers on military history, such as Hingham at War, Oral History of New England Combat Veterans, and Surviving New England's U-Boat War. Jim currently serves as the Friends of Wompatuck news editor and Wompatuck Park historian. We thank both Scott and Jim for their service to our country and to our community. Their formal remarks today will run about an hour or so, leaving some time for questions. So now let's welcome Scott McMillan.
Thank you, Eileen. Well, as we can see, John Davis, Governor John Davis from Hingham, also was the Secretary of the Navy from 1897 to 1902. And anyway, he was the Secretary of the Navy in a time when things were starting to build up around here, and he and Teddy Roosevelt, who was he really didn't get along with Teddy Roosevelt. And when Teddy Roosevelt became the president in 1901, they kind of had an outfalling, and it caused Governor Long to resign his post as Secretary of the Navy. But we think that he may have already got started and getting this show on the road with the Hingham Munitions Depot. They were looking for a place up and down the East Coast to build a naval ammunition depot. This happens to be John Long's house on Cottage Street. There's a bird sanctuary across the street from number 48 Cottage Street. You can still go there today. It's one of Hingham's parks. So here's the origin of the park. You can see they went up and down the East Coast, and in 1903 they decided on Hingham as a space because of the rolling hills and a lot of its closeness to the water, the rail lines, and all kinds of things that would make it a nice spot for a Navy base. These are some of the newspaper articles. Back in the day, it explains some of the properties. You can't really read that. It gives the acreage and the amount of money that the people were paid when the Navy took them by eminent domain. Some of the acreages were over 100 acres at the time, so they were pretty sad to see that. The people that owned it were pretty sad to see it go. But as it is today, it's kind of a nice spot to walk and visit, and otherwise it would have been all built up with houses and stuff along the river. This is some of the property, the different properties. In the green is the Hingham side, the blue is obviously the river, and on the Weymouth side, Great Esker Park, and you can see the different plots of land. Some of them are pretty large. One of them was owned by Reuben Hersey. I believe that was close to 100 acres or a little over, and that was taken in, I believe, 1906. We have a list of all of the Hingham names of the people who owned property there and what the Navy paid them at the park in the museum. Here you go. Some of Reuben Hersey had over 100 acres. There's a group, over 100 pieces of property in Hingham were taken by the Navy. And there were, like I said, fishing lodges. There were all kinds of farms, everything else along the river's edge, hunting lodges. Camp Hingham now is another part of the park. In 1909, Camp Hingham opened up. They were kind of figuring out what was going to be done down the road. They knew Europe was getting ready for battle and unrest over there. So they built Camp Hingham, which trained about 600 men at a time in the Navy. And they also took, in 1917, they took Bumpkin Island. It was a hospital for children, a children's hospital, and they took Bumpkin Island, and They made that into another camp, and it was a hospital for any infectious diseases. If any of the soldiers caught infectious diseases, they could put them out there, which didn't happen. So they made it another training station, and that took about 1,750 sailors at a time over there. This is the site of the World War I pier, 1914. You can see the bridge in the background is the Back River Bridge. That bridge was a pivot bridge. It turned and would let the barges come in and then out. And the building that you see on the far left is the dock house for that particular pier. So they were leveling the land. You can see the little bit of water on the right, and they filled in and leveled it all up. This is a picture of the barracks at the Camp Hingham. And these are all wooden barracks. I think the next slide actually shows a little bit better. That's basically the same picture with walkways around, and they had each group of barracks would hold about 200 sailors, and they had 3 different groups of buildings, so they could put out about 600 sailors at a time. And as the war got started, they actually brought in tents, and they added to that. So it held quite a few more than the 600 that it was originally built for. This is the parade deck. You can see the barracks is on the left. This is the mess hall in the middle. On the right side, the YMCA is off further to the right. It was connected to the mess hall, and that's where the gentlemen could go and write letters, and they could buy postcards and all kinds of stuff and send them home. So you see the YMCA there's the mess hall again. The YMCA is tucked down to the right. It's about right in the middle of that photograph. These pictures were all black and white, and they've been colorized to kind of make it stand out a little bit better. These are 2 pictures from 1918. The top picture is called the ship's company. Those would have been the sailors that would have worked at the base. You see the ones in the white on the right there, they would have been the cooks. And the ones in the middle, you can see the Dixie caps, they would have been the workers. Then you've got the middle part with just the sailors. They were probably the training staff. On the left, you've got the band. And I believe the fire department was in there somewhere. That picture is actually much longer than what you see there. The bottom picture is one of the graduating classes that would have gone through there about 1918. This is a bunch of the civilian workers that the base hired. There was about 2,000 civilian workers that worked in there at the maximum. That was right around World War II, 1944 or so. In between the wars, they had the WPA, which is the Work Progress Administration. All right, back to World War I. That was there's a better picture of the YMCA tucked in at that far end of the building with some of the sailors and some of the civilian, probably teachers and stuff. This is inside the mess hall in the kitchen. This is the main gate at the Hingham Naval Ammunition Depot, probably on Fort Hill Street by Thomas Auto Body, where it is now. It's a little different look than what it is. You can see the little guard shack in the back there was where the Marine would have stood in inclement weather. We actually have that building in the entrance to Bare Cove Park now. I did a little restoration on that a few years ago and found on the inside of that door a gentleman's initials carved in the door with 1918 as a date. You all familiar with that? That is the commander of the base's house, Quarters A, which is now the Conservatory of Music. That was taken in 1922. They've since obviously added on to that. The conservatory has done a fantastic job up there, restoring that building and keeping it up. Herbert L. Foss is a Medal of Honor recipient from the Spanish-American War. He is not originally from Maine, from Hingham, but he grew up in Maine and moved to Hingham and settled in Hingham after he came back from the Spanish-American War. And He worked in the depot as a civilian. He had the largest funeral procession in Hingham at the time with military honors. He was buried at the Fort Hill Cemetery. This is that same pier that we saw in the previous photograph that showed the bridge in the background. This is the pier that was in dire need of some work. This is some of the WPA workers that in the 1930s and stuff, they were really, everyone was looking for a job after the Depression, so everyone was happy and thrilled to get a job. And it was good wages, and they did a great job over there building some of the houses. They re-roofed a lot of the houses and the buildings, the magazines, and all of the different filling houses and stuff that you'll see further on. This is them redecking the pier down by the Back River Bridge. That's a better picture of the bridge. The pilings, a lot of the pilings that are there, you can still see those today. And there is an existing road that right across from the 99 restaurant, there's an existing road that still goes to the old bridge. And there it is, completed after a couple of years of work. And that wooden section is completely gone now. There is we do have a fence up back where the grass line is, and there's a couple of picnic tables on that foundation of where that building stood. There's an aerial view from 1940 of the whole depot. You can see Beale Street coming down, cutting that top corner off. Fort Hill Street is along the bottom edge. And all of those large rectangular buildings are what they call magazines. That's where they would have stored all of the munitions that was made. And you really can't see it here, but there are what they call barricades. There were 3 barricades that were built, big cement abutments on the side, and they would back the trains in that were loaded with munitions in case anything happened, an accident or anything, it would blow straight up in the air, wouldn't hit anything else. So there were 3 barricades, probably about 9 o'clock on that map. And you can see the river, and then the Weymouth side, you can still see one of the, right under the word ready, under the E, you can see the drive-in movie theater. So a lot of the sailors would go at night, they would go up to that end, and they could watch the movie from on this side of the river. This is the Marine detachment from 1941. You can see some of the Marine barracks in the back, and this would have been up in the hill where the DPW stands now. This is the VT fuse line that they were talking about earlier. It was a top secret thing for World War II. What it was, it sent a radio wave. They had a little tiny fuse in the VT stands for vacuum tube. And it had a little tiny fuse inside the cartridge. And when they fired it up in the air, it sent a radio wave out around the projectile. And anything that came within that radio wave, the projectile would blow up. It was a proximity fuse. And it cut down the amount of rounds that it took. A round is 1 bullet. Originally, it took 2,400 rounds to shoot down an enemy plane. And when they came up with this invention, it cut that down to 400. So it really was a top secret thing, and they didn't want that to fall in the enemy hands. This is a letter. I don't know if you can read the letter on the side here by General Patton. He said that was one of the most devastating things in World War II next to the atomic bomb. This is obviously a Superman magazine from '46, and on the back cover of it is a picture of the radio brain VT fuse. This gentleman here, Norman Connors, was stationed at the depot, and he actually invented the 4-way pallet, which made it so much easier for the gentleman to pick these items up and place them down on the deck of a ship or anything else, because before that you could only pick them up from front and back, and it was, when they're piling them in there, it made it difficult to raise and lower the pallets and go pick them up. So he came up with a 4-way pallet, and it revolutionized the whole basically the industry, and he went ahead and became a magazine. He had all kinds of inventions after that, and he made it big. This is them preparing some of the projectiles to be shipped off. This is one of the filling houses, the F house. They had a number of filling houses in there. The Fire Museum is actually in one of the filling houses that used to be in the depot. Next slide, I think, is another. So what they would do is most of them were painting. They painted them up, but they loaded these up and they placed them on the pallets. There's the four-way pallet that you can see right there. You could run the forks from the fork truck in from either direction, all four ways. And that's at the D house, or the G filling house, excuse me. Explosive D was a orange powder, and when they were doing the filling, the people that would come home, my grandfather worked in there. He was actually in that picture of the VT fuse also, and they would come home and they would be covered with this orange tint, from the explosive D. There's an aerial view of Quarters A, the conservatory again. Pretty nice little place to hang your hat, I guess, if you were a commanding officer with your family. Now, the railroad in there went to every building. Every building had a railway and a dock in front of it so that they could deliver the munitions, store them, and then when they needed to go pick them up, everything was all numbered and lettered. If you were in a building, say this was the inside the magazine, they would have letters coming down the side, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then in the girders up above, they would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you needed to go to 2A2, it was basically just, they would know exactly where to go and pick the stuff up, and they could wheel it out. And every magazine had a loading dock right outside where the train would pull up right in front of it, and they could just load it right into the train. They would drive it down to the pier, which had its own loading dock. They would drive it right up. They would offload the munitions onto the pier itself. They had elevators in the pier, built right into the pier, where they could raise and lower to the height of the barge, load it in the barge. And that's what the green dock house was. It was a records-keeping building. They would keep track of what came and went. So the railroad tracks, there was a number of miles of railroad tracks in there. These are some of the other, these are civilian workers, and you can see they were the emergency electrical workers. They worked on the telephone system, kept all of the power up and running. There was a number of workers in there that, the whole place was a city. It had its own telephone exchange. It had its own electrical system. It had its own water system. It had 3 huge water towers, and it also had 2 underground water tanks of about 250 million gallons each. So they were built up in the highest part of the depot. And so if they lost the towers, the water would be still had pressure in the fire hydrants and everything else. So they had their own fire department. They had their own electrical, like I say, telephone workers, electrical workers, water department, everything. This is the Navy band from World War II. You can see most of them are black. And these are some of the names. Some of the big name jazz players were actually stationed at the depot. And they would go around to the different bases and into Boston, and they would go over to the shipyard, and every time they launched a ship, they would play, play songs. But I don't know if any of you recognize any of the names up there, but some of them were pretty well known. Now, I don't know if you know that building in the background, but this is either 4th of July parade, possibly, or Memorial Day. I don't know exactly which, but all of the troops participated. I can remember growing up as a kid on Fort Hill Street, every Memorial Day, they would send a group of Marines over, and they would fire a salute at each of the cemeteries for Memorial Day. And That's another fairly familiar picture, Talbot's, and that was the Servicemen's Recreation Center, and also, I believe, at the behind where the post office is now, there was another a famous meeting place for the young ladies and the sailors, called the Rathskeller, I believe it was. And also the community center was another serviceman's hangout. Now, at the peak of all activity, this is the personnel that were there. There were about 3,000 civilians. Like I say, a lot of them were women at the time because all the men were obviously away or they were deemed unfit for service, but they could still do loading of ammunition and stuff. So there were 375 Marines there at this particular time at the peak. 721 Navy, and plus or minus, it went up and down all over the place. So this was at the peak now. I mean, in between wars, it would drop off, sometimes going down to like 50 people, just to keep it up and, keep everything moving. This is the 50-year plaque. The 1904 was the date when the Navy put feet on the ground at the first opening of the whole thing. And so 1954 would have been the 50th year anniversary. This plaque was in front of the administration building that is over on Beale Street, or was on Beale Street, where they built those 5 or 6 houses along the left side. Just recently, it was just tucked in behind there. And the stone that the plaque was on is actually still there. Somebody stole the plaque long ago because it was bronze. And this is the entrance to the depot, obviously back in the 40s and 50s, somewhere around in there. This one you really can't tell too much because there's no vehicles in sight, but that was the original Navy sign. The 2 posts that sign used to sit on are still there, as is the lamp post. I don't know if you can really see it that well there. There's a lamp post right in front of the number of where the credit union used to be. That's the gatehouse. The credit union, there's a square box up between the peak of that house with a number in it. So this is back in, like I say, 1940, 50 or so. And so this was the gatehouse. My grandfather actually supposedly, he was a mason and he did a lot of work in there and supposedly built that gatehouse, did some work on that. The credit union started out as a small little section, and the section in the back, they actually had 3 or 4 overhead garage doors, and they parked the MP's Jeeps inside. And now that is the school department uses that building for their bus drivers and stuff. They come in and do all the paperwork and stuff in there. That's another picture of the gatehouse. Now this is a little later. This is probably in the 50s. You can see the blinds, the shutters that are on the building with the little anchor cut into them are still there, I believe. And you can see some of the old pickup trucks in the background there. They look like they're in the 50s. And this is a Hingham Quincy Patriot Ledger article from 1962. You can't really read that, but this is the closing of the base, and this one gentleman is doing an inventory on the 16-inch 50 caliber projectiles. And those things are, as you can see, they're over 5 feet tall, and they weigh about 2,200 pounds. And those are fired from the battleships, and they can shoot those, hurl those things out about 20 miles, and pretty accurately too, over the horizon. So if you're in a battleship, it makes quite a noise. And if you come to the museum, which is open on the 24th of this month in the park, from 10 to noon, we have videos of the battleships firing the 16-inch guns, and it's quite a sight. This is the entrance to Bare Cove Park now, in by the Model Railroad Club off of Fort Hill Street. This is the main gate, and this was given to the town by the federal government as used for a park to be used by the general public. This is a map from John Richardson, who was the first chairman of the Bare Cove Park Committee. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but when he did the map, he put in all these little intricate things of where he found different things. Like he found there's a barge, like a 1700-year barge from the 1700s. Any of the animals that he saw at the time, he would write down. He saw an eagle at a certain time and in a certain place, and it's pretty neat the way he kind of like everything is there. Little Squirrel Hill, different things. These are some of the pictures of the buildings later on after they were decaying before they actually got taken down. And this is inside the ice house, which is close to the conservatory. The ice house, there was a pond right there, and they used to harvest the ice, and they would store it in this building. And the ceiling was stuffed full between the rafters with sawdust to use it as an insulation. So it was about, I want to say the roof was probably a good 2 feet thick, and it was all full of sawdust, and the walls were all insulated, so they could cut that ice, put that ice in there in the winter, and still have ice going in the middle of summer. This is another picture of the Marine Barracks, which is up on top of the hill where the DPW is now. That's the original flagpole, which is long gone. The dog graveyard is up on that hill too. There's 2 Marine Corps mascot dogs buried up on that hill. And when they passed away, they were given full military honors with firing a 21-gun salute and the whole bit. Pretty impressive. And there's pictures of those at the museum too. This is inside one of the old barracks that, as it was getting decayed, and people would break in and smash things, and it was getting to be a real nuisance. So they started tearing them down in the 70s and 80s. This is one from the 80s. Obviously, you can see the Weymouth Port in the background. You can see the shipyard with the smokestack over there. The pier, that's the old World War I pier down by 3A. You can see. The building in the back of that is one of the buildings that was torn down by the state. Actually, that little area was owned by the state. We had a couple of murders take place on that state property a number of years ago, and so they came in and they tore everything down and cleaned all that stuff up. There's another picture of the same, and you can still see the pier, which was. This is actually the World War II pier, and you can see the building in the background. Just in back of the pier is the Dockhouse Museum. Yeah, the little small one down, right? That's a shadow, but you can see a little bit to the right there. Right there is the Dockhouse Museum, and you can see that's the pier is still standing at that time. And that was, like I say, 4 feet off the ground. The railroad track went to every one of the magazines, and you can still see the remnants of the railroad tracks in places. And there's the Dockhouse Museum. And this is inside. There's a ton of pictures. This is fairly old now. This picture, it's fairly old, but. That uniform, that was my father's uniform. He was, like I say, stationed here in 1944. He met my mother, was from Hingham, and he was originally from Georgia. They hit it off and ended up marrying my mother, and the rest is, as we say, history. This is one of the events that takes place over in by the museum in the river. The Hingham High School Regatta team rows up and down the river, and they're over there in the spring, and they're usually practicing. And matter of fact, they just cleaned all the boats up last week and got them out of there. So they practice in the river, and they have a couple of meets every once in a while where they'll have 5 or 6 high schools all compete in the river. This is an up-to-date map of the Bare Cove Park. As you can see, the green section is Bare Cove Park. The white that you see is mostly the private homes in Hingham Woods, Beals Cove, Conservatory Park. But that was all included in the base at one time. You can see the outline is the Beale Street, Fort Hill Street area, so it was close to 1,000 acres in there. The park itself is about close to 500 now. We just received a few more acres from the state not too long ago after we had the little incident that took place in there. There's a couple of gates. There's the roadway that comes in off of Fort Hill Street across from the railway station is the main entrance to the park. So that's the main entrance to the park. There's also another entrance over on Beale Street by Lynchfield. And the Green Dockhouse Museum is, you can see that one next to the K and back, right just to the right of the K and back. Down a little, right there's the Dockhouse Museum. All right, I guess I can give it to Jim. Thank you very much.
Well, the military history of the annex actually begins with Chief Wompatuck. He was killed in a raid by the Mohawk Indians in 1669, and they were aided by the French militia. And Wompatuck means white deer, and he was born in 1627. His father was Chickatawbut, and he died in 1633. And Chickatawbut means house of fire, and they were from the Massachusetts tribe, and that means dwellers of the hills. So apparently they made two big deeds, and one was 1655 and 1665, where most of the South Shore was transferred to the early settlers. So early in July, the United States felt that they were eventually going to get into the World War II because they were aiding the British over in the Battle of the Atlantic. And so they decided to take over some properties over there, and 60 homes were taken. And they needed about, 3,700 acres for their operation. And the towns were Hingham, Cohasset, Scituate, and Norwell. And so this is one of the homes that was over there. And there's 3 still left. In fact, if you go through the front gate to Wompatuck State Park and take a left, there's 3 still left. These are the barricaded sidings being constructed. There were 20 put in, and they'd use those to park trains in overnight. They were 300 feet long, and they were constructed in such a way to send the blast up. Okay, and this is what it looks like now. Some of them are totally filled up. Okay, so this is the U-87, and it was in Boston Harbor in 1942, and it sunk 2 ships and mined Boston Harbor, and 92 people died. And that was at the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was such a horrific experience in the beginning that throughout the war, I think that within the 200-mile limit, the Germans sunk 20 of our ships, causing 303 deaths and 819 survivors. And as far as ships sunk and lives lost, the first 6 months of the war were deadlier than Pearl Harbor. So in the beginning of the war, 1 ship was sunk every 4 hours. But eventually that was turned around in 1943 when they had more anti-submarine measures, and they broke the code too. Okay, this is from a coal ship that was sunk by the U-853, and it was off of Rhode Island. It was about 5 miles from shore. And on these freighters, sometimes they'd be armed, and this one was a 5-inch shell, And it's an inspection slip, and you can see on the lower half the initials of the people that worked on it or inspected it from the depot. So the ship was sunk and 12 people died. And eventually, that was in 45, on May 5th, they caught the U-boat 853 the day later, and they sunk that. But that U-boat also sunk the USS Eagle off of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, and 49 sailors were killed on that. So, and this is one of the explosive magazines. There's still some there. There's about 6 left, but they're about half as big as this. But they're constructed in such a way that if they did have an explosion, they'd be sent up. The power of the explosion would go up. There were 188 of them at the time. Now 6 left. So this is a classification yard. So when the trains came in, the first thing they'd do is they'd decide what goes where within the depot. And they'd come here and there'd be 2 tracks on one side, well actually 4, and the same thing on the other side. And then they'd be sent out according to what goes where, fuses or rockets. So, and these are 3 engineers that worked there, Herc, Conway, and Spillane. Herc was from Hingham, Herc Henningsen. And you'll see in the next slide, that inscription's still there. It's near the transfer building. It's only about a quarter of a mile away, and it says Friday the 13th, 1956. They put it on there. And here's the transfer building. So when the trains would come down and they'd transfer their load from the train to the trucks. They were parked along the kind of like a loading zone to the right. And that's what's going on there. And sometimes the trucks would come to the transfer building and they would take warheads to New London, Connecticut. Okay, that's my father with VT fuses. And that's where the VT fuse operation occurred. And the VT fuses, there are 5 different types: radio, acoustic, optical, pressure, and magnetic. And this is the boiler house. There were 2 of them there, and they were coal-fired. The rocket motor building. And attached to this on the left, they had like a walkway that was covered, and all the lockers were there. And on the other side was this overhead conveyor belt that led to the powder house and went over the street and also the railroad tracks. And down from that walkway that was covered, the lockers, went to the lunchroom. That's it there. These pictures were taken, I'd say, about maybe a little over 10 years ago. And they took all these buildings down about 8 years ago, 6 to 8 years ago. This is the inhibitor building, and this is where they applied inhibitors on the rockets. And what that did is, there are plastic strips, and it would cut the burn down so it's a steady flow. Otherwise, you'd have an explosion, or it'd burn off too quick. So you'll see in the next slide what the inhibitor is. It's like a cruciform with a propellant, and there are the plastic inhibitors that would control the burn. So, and that's what the people would do. Mainly women worked here. They were applied in these booths here, and they had these ducts above, and it'd take all the fumes out, supposedly, to and back. And there was a fan house in back of this building. But the problem was the fumes were so overwhelming that when my mother worked there, they had to open all the windows and doors, even in the winter, and they had to operate this whole thing with their winter clothes on, big coats, because the fumes are so intense. And a lot of them got, from what I heard from an inspector, TNT heart, which is, I looked it up, and the TNT heart is like a troponin protein given off by the heart when it's under stress. So a lot of them had that particular problem. And this is the administration building that was, as you come through the main gate, it was on the left, and it started out as a construction building, just for the construction workers, but they turned it into an admin building. And this started off as Guided Missile Service Unit 215 headquarters, and they'd service 3 different, well, actually 2 different types of missiles there. And after that closed down, this was built in the late 50s, and then in the 60s it became a production for the landmines, the XM47 landmines for Vietnam, and then after that it was the headquarters for the 184th Infantry Brigade. And they took that down in 2005. This is George Neaten. He was one of the guided missile officers that worked at that gumshoe plant. He died last February. And this is one of the missiles that was serviced there, the Taira Missile. It's about 15 feet long, 13.5 inches wide. And the other one is the Terrier. And the Terrier missile actually shot down a MiG and a couple of MiGs in Vietnam from the USS Biddle and the USS Sterett. There's one there. And what they do at the Guided Missile Service Unit, they would test the missiles. They'd test them here, and then they'd bring them out to the ships out in the Boston Harbor and load them there through a barge. And there's George Neaten in 2014, and the guy on the left is Steve Gammon. He was the park director at the time. There's a shell there on the right, and that was found in the Back River by a friend of ours. He was Vinny Chapetta. Anyways, he was clam digging, and he used to be a crane operator at Fall River. Okay. This is the burning area. It was cleaned up about 8 years ago, but they burnt off a lot of the powder there. Cordite and that D powder, which is ammonium perchlorate. And I looked that up as far as hazardous material, and deep powder causes kidney cancer, and that's what my father died of when he was 65 years old. So we think it might have been through this place. We're not sure, of course, but that was a speculation. And they had a lot of fires here, fires and explosions. And sometimes the local fire departments were brought in to put them out. Okay. So here are the contaminants being removed. So that was about 8 years ago. And this is a ship that was sunk on May 11th, 1944. And it was sunk off of Boston Harbor about 14 miles. They were burning off rockets, and they had a fire and then a big explosion, and it sunk. And out of a crew of 31, 17 died, and the whole Hingham contingent, 11 guys, crewmen, sailors, they were all killed, and they were all blacks. And at that time, a lot of the black servicemen were given menial jobs, like stewards handling ammunition. And there was another explosion in Port Chicago in California where over 200 of them were killed through an explosion. And a lot of them refused to go back to work after that explosion, and they put them in prison. Eventually they were released after about a month. But that was in 1944. Okay. And Stanford Seneca was a full-blooded chief from the Seneca tribe from New York. And he died at the ammunition depot because he inhaled fumes when he was cleaning shells. And Frank Krause, he owned Bill's Outboard on 3A. And he was working at the Mine Anchor building, and he screwed down I guess it's an ox too tight, and it blew up in his chest. And when I went to talk to him over there, he said he kept on getting the fragments of that shell out of his chest. Every now and then they'd surface on his skin and take him out. So that was in 1953. And there's Stanford Tzedakah. He's next to my father. My father's there's Stanford, there's my father on the right. Okay. These mixing buildings, that's during the Vietnam War. From 1967 to 68, they manufactured mines for the war. There was the XM47 gravel mine project. And those 4 buildings on the left were mixing buildings, and they'd use Freon with alcohol. And the idea of the mine was if it was soaked in Freon, it was inert. So once it dried out, it became armed. And they would assemble them in the building on the right, but they had a lot of explosions there. And I guess on the conveyor belt where the mines were, they'd explode, and sometimes the employees would have to go home with earaches. So eventually they had a big accident in Hanover. And there's the mine itself. And how it operated is that they'd be packed in these big pods, and the helicopter would be loaded with them, with the pods, and it'd take off, and over the area of the drop zone, it'd pitch up and they'd all fall out. And the theory behind this is they wanted to create a perimeter around a downed pilot so the Viet Cong NVA would be able to pick them up. And they also used it in Khe Sanh and also the demilitarized zone in Vietnam. So it was 3 to 8 minutes, they'd become armed. So this is another mixing building here. It's still there. You can see the blast walls. And so they had a big explosion here at Hanover and King Street. And I remember my father saying that that place is, fireworks they call it, was very unsafe. And he said someday they're going to have an explosion. And lo and behold, they did. And 1 man was killed and 15 were injured. And he said, see, I told you. But the Hingham guys were supposed to go over on that day. But lucky for them, the bus broke down because it was so cold. It was in December of 1967. So after the explosion, they were brought in to defuse the mines and ship them out, and they all got accommodations from the Army for doing it. So this is Bunker 9. It's still over there, and that's where they had the nuclear depth charge. It was a Rock missile. And the way it worked is they'd fire them out of from a destroyer, and you come down in a parachute and then go in the water and travel around and seek out its prey and explode. But they just continued using this 1989. They don't carry them anymore. And this is the guy that was in charge of it, one of them. He's called a snapper. That was one of the classifications. And the next guy was our neighbor in Rockland. He was a leading man. And he was also in charge of that bunker. Great neighbor. And this person here on the right, he's still alive, Rahn Me. He brought the nuclear depth charges up from Quonset Point, Rhode Island. And one time he was caught for almost given a ticket for driving too slow because he couldn't go over 35 miles per hour. There's Sammy Ahmadi, everyone knows him. But Sammy's nephew, Tony Ahmadi, I don't know whether you remember him or not. He was a famous hockey player for the Blackhawks. And Tony Ahmadi's cousin is Charlie Coyle, plays for the Bruins now. And it turns out Charlie Coyle's grandmother was in the same wedding party as Rahn Me's wife. She was the best maid. So anyways, there's a connection there. It was a small world story. George Bartlett witnessed the explosion at the mine anchor building that injured Franny Krause. And he was also in the Coastal Guard before the war. And he remembers over in, I think, Hog Island, Spinnaker Island now, they had 2 16-inch guns, and he said they only fired them once, and it broke all the windows in that part of Hull. Leo Parente was a former supervisor, and he was full of a lot of funny stories. He was a World War II veteran, and when he was over in Europe, he captured an SS major, and he was wanted for war crimes, and they eventually hung him. And this Peter Stonitz, he was a crane operator over at the depot, and he was the one that took out a lot of the ordnance from the back river with a clamshell. And he also operated a train. He was a Guadalcanal veteran too. This is Ruth Bates. Some of her family came to Hingham in 1635. They're buried right behind here. Caleb and Clement. Her claim to fame is she worked for Captain Bates and Commander Dunning. And after Hingham, she went to Washington, and she dated this German general. His name was Gerstorff. And she also had another boyfriend at the same time, Tom. And Gerstorff was famous for he made an attempt on Hitler's life, but he survived because the theory was he was going to tie fuses on his body, grab Hitler, and explode himself and kill the Fuhrer. And that was in '43. But Hitler came in and went so quickly, wasn't able to catch up with him. So he survived the war. And she kind of fell in love with him, but then her boyfriend at the time said, "You're not going to date any damn German." And this is Admiral Jim Gorman. He remembers when he was over in Korea using a rocket with the Hingham stamp on it. That's Fred Baylin. He was stationed here in 1943. He remembers the time when the cruiser Richelieu got torpedoed, and they put the crew over at the Annex, and they alternated a French sailor with a Marine, and they communicate with sign language. And all the girls in Hingham were in love with the Frenchmen because they had these colorful uniforms, the red pom-pom on top. And he also told me that the Frenchmen would carry cheese in their belts and use a paring knife to, whenever they got hungry, they would eat some cheese. And also he pulled guard duty over there in '43. And he had a horse named Tony. And sometimes Fred would fall asleep going back to the stable, but the door was too low. And when he'd go through the door, it would knock him off his saddle. So Fred he went to Saipan, and he earned the Purple Heart. He was the only survivor out of a patrol of 8. And this is the park as it is today. Let's see it. In 1967, it was created with 2,800 acres. Today, it's 3,750. So that's it.
Thank you. And I think our speakers would be happy to take questions. There are a lot of terms and people and places mentioned. So if you want to direct your question to Scott, Jim, or either of them.
They were tested twice, but they never used them.
Tested locally?
No.
Or
Probably in the Pacific.
Well, the base closed its doors in 1962. The Navy held it in reserve for 10 years. So in 1972, the federal government started selling off different portions of land. Beals Cove, Hingham Woods, conservatory.
To whom did they sell it? They sold it
To individual contractors that wanted to build homes, and like I said, Beals Cove was all condos and
Why wasn't the rest of it sold?
It was given to the town. It was given to the town with the stipulation that it be used for a park in perpetuity for recreational and educational use. That's why you had a lot of the buildings in there were educational. Along Beale Street, there were some buildings that were for like a 20 or 30-year lease they had. They were given the buildings for 20 years, and then after 20 years, 30 years, whatever it was, they could sell whatever it is. And that's why you've got these other new places cropping up all of a sudden. 30 years is up. There was a Project Turnabout was one of them. After the 20 years was up, the Hastings, bought the property and turned that into a, Back River Townhomes and. Yes, yes. The annex, which was Wompatuck, the annex was added on in World War II.
yeah.
The depot was started in 1904 for World War I, and it was not big enough when World War II came about. It wasn't big enough to hold everything here. I'm not exactly sure. I think it was all run by the same person, and but they went back and forth. Sandra Owens actually grew up in the depot.
My father actually came here in 1918 as a Navy man, so he was here during World War I. And his position during World War II was he was in charge of making sure the munitions were available at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's what brought my family to Hingham. And we lived at Quarters L, which is now adjacent to where Lynch Field is. And it's where those new apartments or condominiums or whatever they are that have gone up there. And I'll just say personally, they remind me of military barracks that were there at the time when I lived there. That's all I'll say about that. But as a child growing up, I started first grade here in Hingham and lived there until I graduated from high school in 1957. As Scott said, it was a little self-contained community. There was a swimming pool up where the barracks were, so we had swimming in the summertime. There were movies. There was a different movie every night. If I wanted to go to the movies, I had to have my homework done. That was when I got into high school. The war I remember most was the Korean War. And by that time, I was a young teenager. The Marines that were stationed there were not much older than I was. My girlfriend and I were just talking about this the other day. I remember most of the Marines that got stationed there came from Camp Pendleton or Camp Lejeune. They then were being shipped out to Korea. So my girlfriend and I would know Marines that were only 3 or 4 years older than we were. And I can remember talking to them and sending some of them off to go to war. And at the post exchange that was at the depot at the time, we would go over maybe twice a month, and they would have the killed, wounded, and missing in action posted there. And many, not many, but some of the names that were there were men that had been stationed in Hingham and went off to Korea. I'll just say we also had on Armed Forces Day, they would have a big ceremony over at Lynch Field, what is now Lynch Field. And they would have fire, what do they call those?
Flamethrowers.
Flamethrowers. They would demonstrate flamethrowers. They would demonstrate other kinds of ammunition, rifles. They would have a big parade. The Navy and the Marine Corps together would have a parade. Also, behind my house, which was Quarters L, up on a hill, there was a fitness area. And my girlfriend and I used to like to go up there and see whether we could do what the military was doing. And they had the barbed wire that was low to the ground, and you'd have to get on your belly and go under the barbed wire. They had the rope pulls. We'd have to pull ourselves up over the barrier. They had the tires that you would have to go through. So my girlfriend and I would go there and see whether we could do what the Marines were doing. It was a wonderful place for me to grow up. I had 1,000 acres to explore. And when I was old enough to ride my bike, I explored that land all the time. It was just a wonderful thing. At times when parents did not want their children to come to the depot because they were afraid. I mean, there was always this feeling that it could be a target. So during World War II, there were not too many children that would come to the depot because their parents were afraid of what could happen. And during the Korean War, fortunately for me, I had friends that lived off the base, so that's where I would go. But I have just fabulous memories of living on that land and exploring it. And I'm so happy that Quarters A is a conservatory. That was the best thing that ever happened to that building. I played in that building with 2 of the children that lived there. and I just gave Scott some pictures today. I recently connected up with two gals. Both of them their fathers were the captains on the Munitions Depot. They both went to Hingham High School. They graduated in 1959, and they just had their 60th class reunion up at the country club about 2 weeks ago. And I hadn't seen them in 65 years. So, and our pictures were as babysitters at the Naval Ammunition Depot when we were all teenagers. So Scott now has the pictures, and he'll put
It'll
them
be in the museum.
Yeah, in the museum. That was the other thing I was so happy about. We finally made a museum because Hingham has a rich military history, but not too many people know about it. And now with Scott, between the GAR Hall and the Dock House, we have a good assortment of military memorabilia that really does do tribute to what happened here in Hingham during, well, World War I when my dad came here, and then World War II and Korea. So that's my story.
I should mention that also at Town Hall now, we have a wonderful exhibit about the shipyard. So there's a number of places in town you can visit.
Yes, there was. It was built in 1944, and on opening day, it served 1,400 people. It was built for the civilian workers. The Navy and Marine Corps personnel had the mess hall that they could eat at, and the other civilian workers either had to brown bag it or bring a lunchbox or whatever. So they talked the Navy into putting in that restaurant. .228. So it wouldn't have been the depot.
That was Wompatuck State.
I'm sure it was Wompatuck, because it was after Wompatuck.
Yeah, they had,
Yeah, they had, the Army was up there for a while afterwards, doing, they had helicopters and stuff coming in on some of the roadways and stuff. They had,
yeah, I think it was from 71 to 82 they were there.
okay.
So, and they had guards, plenty of, I mean, I went through a gate one time and they caught me, so.
Well, they used a lot of the same equipment. They had, actually, Route 3A, there was an overpass that the trains and the cars could go underneath the overpass where the Route 3A remained open. So they did use the same trains, they used the same, some of the same vehicles, and maybe the same guards. Well, they had civilian police also, but the Marines pretty much handled the security end of it, and the Navy kept the base up and running. The Navy was the security. They had Marines on horseback patrolling the perimeter of the fence. And later on, I can remember as a child growing up on Fort Hill Street, the fence was in my backyard, and the Marine guards would actually walk the perimeter. You know, every 15 minutes, another guy would go by. They also cut the top of Fort Hill down. If you go over Fort Hill Street, where the cemetery is, you can see there's a right at the top of the hill, it's been cut down about 20 feet so that the trucks could make it up and over the hill. And
Yeah,
that
and
was
they-
done in the 50s.
And they said they did the new Bridge Street just to cut down on the time that it would take to go around, like through Weymouth.
Right. They did do the new bridge, and they did cut that hill down to make transportation, so they didn't have to go through Hingham Square for one thing, with, the stuff on the trucks.
Scott, did Captain Delory ever tell you the story of the fire they had there?
They had a number of fires there.
Well, for those of you that know, Bob Delory was a very well-known citizen in Hingham. He was a captain in the fire department for years, and he related a story to me. I'm not sure if he was directly involved with it or not, but right where Carlson Fields are was the fire station. There were two fire stations, one at Mainside Park and one at the Annex, manned by civilians. And they worked 24-hour tours of duty, which is uncommon in those days. But, and they changed shifts at 6 o'clock in the morning, as Bob related the story to me. And one morning at 6 a.m., the oncoming shift over in Mainside Park, the fire station was right where Carlson Fields was, came in and said, "What time did the fire come in?" And said, "What are you talking about?" I says, "Look out the window." There was a building directly across the street from the fire station, and that relationship would be like from here to Whitney Gordon's. Direct line of sight. The building was like 40 by 60, 2 stories. It burned flat with the firefighters in the building sleeping, and they never knew it. And just for the record, that did not happen on my watch. But another thing is, I believe today's the birthday of the U.S. Marine Corps.
It is. It is.
Happy birthday.
Semper Fi.
Fred has a question, and thank you for your service, sir.
Yeah.
Stay sitting.
Can I stay sitting? All right. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
I was one of those Marines you're talking about down there that pulled in as soon as the war started. I joined the Marine Corps when, well, the war was declared December 7th, 1941. I joined December 15th, something like that, 1941. So in case you say, well, that's a long time, how old must you be? I'm 94 now, so I did it. And I went through boot camp, and I made first guard or station duty was here in the Hingham Naval Ammunition Depot. And I must have pulled in here somewhere at the very end of February 1942. I was here to 42 and up till the latter part of maybe 43. And I had some nice experiences here and so forth, you know. I was one of those guards that was on that horse you're talking about running around and so forth. And how I got onto the horse, only coming into that place for the first time, was that I walked post when they first got here. When we first got here, we didn't have rifles or anything. We had 45 pistols and a sheepskin coat. And I was out on post the first night, and I wasn't quite used to all this cold weather. And they found me laying on the ground, shivering, in a fetal position and so forth. They said, well, he's no good for walking posts, and we'll find something else for him. Well, we'll put him on mounted, which is horse patrol, what we call it, the mounted. And they said the horse will keep him warm. Well, the mounted, you lived in the stables with the horses up there, but it was up on a knoll somewhere. I looked for it, and I don't recognize it anymore, you know. But I rode these horses, and I was the guy Jim was talking about. I was on this 12 to 4 watch, and getting back in the 4 o'clock in the morning, I was getting a little drowsy and so forth. I was on the saddle. You went up a little ramp, and there was a door there where you would get off and put your horse inside. Well, I was drowsy, and I kind of missed that. And as Jim told you, I was on it when he went through the door. It had caught me right in the chest and knocked me right off the horse. His name was Tony, and I went in and I spoke to him in the stable, and he didn't even give me a nibble. Anyhow, I was there. We opened the annex, as we call it, the Wompatuck State Park, and when they opened the annex, we pulled men from the main depot, which is where I was, and when we went over, we lived in a civilian house for a while, and there was 3 gates, as I recall there. One was 11th Street gate, one was a Beechwood Street gate, the other was the main gate where the administration building was. So we lived for the first 2 or 3 weeks in a civilian house over there, and our first duty was to make sure all the civilians got out of their house before they start locking it up. And we were doing fine with that. Everybody was leaving, everything was good, except this one old couple at the end near the Beechwood Street, there's a big ramp there now, or a mound or something. You can't get through, but it used to be a gate. You go right into Beechwood, it's the other section of Cohasset. And these people lived in a little bungalow almost to that gate area, and they were all covered, and they wouldn't move. So they told us, go down there and tell these people they got to get out, you know. So at the time, for a weapon piece at the time that they issued us was a Rising submachine gun. And there was 8 of us, and each of us had a machine gun. And so we come as a show of force, knocked on the door and said, look, folks, you know, you got to leave here now. You got to go, yeah. And he closed the door, came back out with a shotgun. And we said, now, wait a minute, sir, you know, we don't want to get rough with you. He said, get off my property. So we turned around, we said to this sergeant was in charge of the group. I said, what do we do? He says, back off, back off. We backed off. And so here we are, 8 Marines with machine guns and this poor old man with a shotgun. And what are we supposed to do? Shoot him? No way. So we don't have any authority to go and do anything physical to him. So we reported to the commanding officer. The commanding officer called the chief of police. Chief of police had to go down and get rid of him. That was the funny thing. Anyhow, anyway.
Thank you, Phil. Well, I want to thank our speakers for all the time they took going through their really extensive collection of photos and maps and stories, and encourage you to go to the Green Dock Museum. Also, the Friends of Wompatuck has a wonderful newsletter that Jim puts out that has also really terrific history of the time that we talked about today. And I have something to give each of you.
Just like to say, we have loose leaf folders full of pictures. The Navy took pictures of everything.
One for each of you. Now, when you walk around the parks, you can be adorned with a cap that says Hingham Historical Society.
Oh, great. Awesome. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for everything you did. That was great.